And I do beg your indulgence for allowing me just to sit here like this. I had a little trouble just a moment ago, and if I was walking around, I'd be laying down. So we'll go on from there. Money doesn't grow on trees, or it doesn't. Here we are tonight at the Historical Society, and this is a well-traveled little presentation I've given it at the Ovegina Toastmasters, Casanova Rotary Club, the public speaking course at Casanova. And I do it because I think it's got an informative message and it's important, at least to me. Now there is a story that we hear in the United States about the unbroken forest that stretched from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. And a squirrel could go from tree to tree and never have to touch foot on ground. Well, that's another one of those myths that we love to exaggerate things and brag about. There were plenty of openings in the forest, natural openings, for soils, the remnants of old fires. The Native Americans, we have learned more recently, did a lot more land clearing than we ever thought originally. So it wasn't an unbroken forest, but it was a large, large forest. And this is a picture that would represent that original forest, a mixture of species, a mixture of sizes, depending on the elevation, the soil type, the aspect, that is, if it's north or south or east or west, and a lot of other factors. These are the same species we have today with us here in the Northeast. And although I'll be talking a good bit about the history of wood in the country, I'll try to bring some bearing on the local scene as well. Now keep this picture in mind. If I can use this thing. Particularly notice this rock here. Because this picture is a picture of a diorama. Probably 50 or more years ago, Harvard artisans, long before computer simulation, literally built scale models of the changing forest in American history, and they're on display until this day at Harvard. And so these pictures I'm going to show you are taken from that Harvard diorama. One of the things we hear about is wilderness. And the United States can take a good bit of pride in saying that we created the first wilderness areas of any country in the world, and that many, many countries have since followed that. And that'll be also true of our national forests and our national parks. We were the first ones to develop these things, and we have it. There's a lot of talk about old growth forests as opposed to the forests we're more used to. And I just wanted to put some perspective to it. Current wilderness in the United States, designated wilderness. Now what is a wilderness? It's basically an area large enough not to have been impacted by humans since the time the colonialists first arrived here. Usually they say it's got to be 5,000 acres, some of them are much more than that, in the millions of acres. We have 95 million acres of designated wilderness. That is, the Congress of the United States has said this is going to be wilderness. There will be no cutting. There will be no ATVs and snowmobiles except for emergencies. You walk into there, you're largely on your own, and although there's a controversy as should they rescue you or not. If it's wilderness, some people say, hey baby, you're out there, something happens, figure out what to do. And others with perhaps a little more humane sentiment say, we'll come and get you. But 95 million acres of designated wilderness. We also have national parks, wildlife refuges, and other named entities that come to 171 million acres. And they're not necessarily designated wilderness, they're operated the same way. This is not all federal land, but much of it is. So we're very rich in this kind of thing that was there when the colonialists first came. A total of 266 million acres. New York is 30 million acres. So this is about 6 times the size of New York, is simply set aside to be what it was, quote unquote, forever. We have in the state of New York an unusual situation with the Adirondack Park, which is a state park. And it's 6 million acres, it's bigger than Yosemite, bigger than Yellowstone. It is the biggest park in the country. It's a little different because the park itself is half private and half public. And there's a lot of give and take there in how that's operated, but it's basically a wilderness. Now, what happened when the colonialists first came? Well, this is, as opposed to that pre-settlement forest, and you notice here in the corner again, and it's going to appear in all the pictures. They began clearing the land, basically for subsistence farming. And the patches they cleared were not huge, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 acres. Many of them on the higher slopes, some down on the lowlands. And this is, as I'll talk about, or there's a slide, I'll just bring it up now while it's logical, true deforestation. Deforestation is a word that gets bandied about a lot. Oh, when you cut a tree, you're deforesting the area. Not necessarily so. What deforestation means is you are changing the land use. You are changing it from forest, in this case, to agriculture. Now, we have a lot more reasons to do that today. We cut the forest to make malls, roads, airports, suburban developments. So there's a lot more pressure on the forest today than there was then. In any case, this is what happened. Subsistence farms began to pop up all over the place. Now, in those early days, I don't think I did a good job at putting the proportion of that train together, but anyway, one of the ways that was early on a matter of importance, of great importance in moving people and things around, was this beast. And what did you call this beast? What do we have that romantic notion of? In the Old West, it was the iron horse. The iron horse was a great power in our country. Okay. It ran in the country, it ran from city to city. Notice how mine drives me out. And is a romantic kind of icon in our country. But what did it run on? A subtitle of this could be called A Country Built on Wood, or maybe that's the title. The Iron Horse. Doesn't give any credit to wood. By 1910, there were over 350,000 miles of railroad. Imagine that. From our first beginnings to 1910, we had built 350,000 miles of railroad. Now the train, the engine, was iron. The cars were wood. And the fuel was wood. We used at that time about 2,500 wooden cross ties per mile of track, which of course was also iron. And for those 2,500 cross ties per mile, it required cutting 15 to 20 million acres of forest per year. Wood ran the iron horse. Wood was the base for the iron horse to run on. So without knowing it, the iron horse should be sharing billing with wood. What else? Well, this one's kind of almost homey. By 1850, there were 3.2 million miles of wooden fences. That was what we built fences of. What do we see now with wooden fences? Where are they? Around your house. Making things pretty, making things country, making things historic. But they're not needed. They just make us feel good. These were needed. 3.2 million miles of wooden fences. Charcoal. By 1910, charcoal was needed to make steel, iron, actually, I didn't say steel. And to make 1,000 tons of iron, you had to cut 20 to 30,000 acres of forest a year. I don't have the number on the total number of acres cut, but I'm sure we used a good bit more than 1,000 tons of iron. So here's another thing where wood was basically the base of getting us into the iron industry. Depending on where you are in the country, the countryside got to look much like this. The College of Forestry that I worked at for so many years has a property in Tully, 3,000 acres, the Hyberg Forest. And we have our classes up there. We have actual buildings with classrooms and so on. And I used to take the students out and stand them on the hillside and say, look out there and tell me what you see in the way of forest. Give me a percentage of forest. And then we come up with numbers. And I would say about the turn of the century, it was 10% forest. All that long ago. And this is kind of what it would have looked like. Now, it happened around central New York around the turn of the century in 1900. In other parts of the country, it was a little earlier. As you go west, obviously, if you move westward, it was a little later. Now, one of the things we have going for us in the Northeast is we have a very resilient forest. And I'll show you some more of that and comment on that later. There's the Rocky Gap. And here's our farmer, still farming the land. And of course, if they didn't farm it properly, the fertilization wasn't what it is now. And the subsistence farmer would get reduced crops and they'd have to move on. And cutting more acres. Now I want you to compare this as we go along to the tropics, because we hear so much about tropical deforestation. And we don't like the notion of tropical deforestation. From 1850 to 1900, farmers in our country cleared an average of 13.5 square miles of forest per day for conversion to agriculture. True deforestation. Once it was cleared, it was no longer forest, it was put into another use. Was it important? You're darn right if you want to live. And our economy in the early years here, I think most of you realize, was built on agriculture. So this was an important thing, but keep that number in mind. 13.5 square miles of forest a day were cut for conversion to agriculture. This was not agribusiness like we see now with thousands and thousands of acres, but these were the small farms of several, 10, 20 acres, and over the years it's grown to bigger and bigger sizes. This was true deforestation. Now, I mentioned the tropical deforestation that we get so upset about. Tropical deforestation is about 16 square miles of clearing forest per day, mostly for conversion to agriculture. 13.5, 16, yeah, it's bigger. Why do they clear it? There is a tropical kind of agriculture called slash and burn. And the native people would literally slash, if you will, cut down an acre or two, plant their crops. The tropical soils are much different than ours. And when they're not held in place by forest and have a canopy over them so the forest doesn't beat down right onto the ground, in a matter of 2 to 3 years, they're worn out. What does the subsistence farmer do? He finds another 2 or 3 acres and cuts it down. That's what's going on. So there's a subsistence farming going on that the tropical deforestation takes place. There's another big kind of thing that goes on that leads to tropical deforestation. You and me. We want beef. And they cut the forest to grow beef to send to McDonald's and other places. So we say, don't do it. stop eating the beef? No. And there's a number of items like that that we need to think about. Now, how about our individual use of wood products today? Each American citizen, man, woman, and child, uses on the average about 749 pounds of paper products, wood products per year. Or no, excuse me, this is just paper products. I don't know about you, but every time I get a paper in, I put it in the bin. Or actually, 4 or 5 days later, I put it in a bin. I throw it next to what my wife calls my boar's nest, where I sit and read. And it piles up so quickly. And then you gotta do something with it. You gotta take it to the landfill. The number one item in landfills in our country is paper. Whether it's the newspaper, cardboard boxes, any of those things, paper is the number one landfill problem. It is biodegradable. You can burn it if you don't break the laws and don't mind a little particulate matter in the air that many people would call pollutants. We use an average of 18 cubic feet, 1 by 1 by 1, of lumber and structural products per year. Each and every one of us, on the average. And each and every one of us putting it on something that might be more easily visioned, we use a tree about 100 feet tall and 16 inches in diameter. Each and every one of us. 300 million of us. What does that mean in the way of acreage cut? A large number. One of the messages I would bring to you is that we need to think about our own personal responsibility in the use of wood and paper. Now, I have been called by a minister a sinner because I'm a forester. And I encourage cutting trees. For proper use, not for trivial use. For proper use. Is it bad? Is it even sinful to cut a tree? Look around your house. You probably sit on wooden chairs at a wooden table, maybe with a wooden pencil, reading a newspaper made out of wood. A lot of other parts of the things we're using sometimes in our cars are made of wood originally. They tear it apart chemically or physically, they put it back together. You don't even know it's wood, but it's there. If it is sinful or bad to cut trees, we're in bad shape. Studies have shown that the energy cost of producing wood substitutes, we see the metal studs now for building. We know cement and concrete, aluminum. The cost of producing wood substitutes is higher than wood in all cases. So for the equivalent use, it takes more energy, more kilowatts, more oil, however you want to use it, to make it than it does to use wood. And there is one thing about wood that often gets overlooked. The Society of American Foresters used to have a bumper sticker. Trees are America's renewable resource. You can't grow more aluminum. You can't grow more oil unless you want to wait several million years. But if you properly manage the land, you can cut the trees and grow a new crop, just like you do with corn or tomatoes or any other agricultural crop. So when people get emotional about cutting trees, I got to know why. What do we see? But the problem is, if we don't curb our wood consumption, we have to ask questions. I hinted at one a while ago. Is it ethical to restrict harvesting in our land while we shift our source to other parts of the world? I am all in favor of our 266 million acres of wilderness. But remember, we've locked that up from cutting timber, and we're asking other people in other parts of the world to produce that timber for us while we have this trigger. It could be cut if we wanted. We have to keep that in mind as we use wood, and we have to figure out what we can do about it. And I hinted even more at this before. Is calling an end to tropical deforestation ethical, since it seems to be a case of don't do what we did, do what we want you to do? We cut 13.5 square miles a day. They're cutting 16. We say, our country grew. We say to them, stop. Who are we stopping it for? What to do? Know the trade-offs. What does it cost to use an iron stud as opposed to a wooden stud? What does it cost to use paper instead of plastic? You know, you go to the grocery stores now. They have a thing called life cycle energy studies and cost studies. It's not enough to look at one generation, but they go into the fact that you put the plastic in the landfill, it doesn't biodegrade. I love our new decorations out there and our beautiful countryside of central New York. The plastic bag hanging on the fence, fluttering in the tree. Do you see paper doing that? There's a cost there. Maybe it's an aesthetic cost, but it's a cost. Take personal responsibility. And that is no different than anything else in conservation in the country now. Recycle, reuse, respect. There's a poet philosopher who said, by the name of Wendell Berry. Anybody familiar at all with Wendell Berry? He said something to the effect, before the table, respect the board. Before the board, respect the log. Before the log, respect the tree. My bad, before the tree, respect the forest. They're all connected, they're not separate entities, and that ecological web strikes again. Okay, let's just finish with some looks at the pictures. After a while, these subsistence farms, began to run out of fertility, crop production went down, it was harder to keep a family going, the farms became abandoned. The other thing that occurred a little later on, before this actually started, and particularly took off after the Civil War, was the Industrial Revolution. When the iron plows came along and the lowlands could be operated so much easier than the highlands, farms tended to gravitate down. And what happened to the uplands? They were abandoned. We have 660,000 acres of abandoned farmland purchased by the state and counties of New York simply because people walked away from them, were no longer paying taxes, and the state and the counties decided we had to protect them. One of the things that began to occur was in this part of the country, what we call old field white pine. Like these here, sometimes around boundaries where there was rocks piled up and they couldn't plow it, the animals dropped seeds or the seeds blew in. Old field white pine, because white pine is one of our favorite species, and because it's windborne, old field white pine, as opposed to the forest-grown white pine, which is a beautiful, tall, straight tree, old field white pine is as wide as it is tall, like some of us. It just spreads out and spreads out. It's not worth a thing for lumber. It does protect the soil, it does cool the radiation and all the rest of the benefits from timber, which I haven't mentioned either. So that eventually, the old field white pine grew up. Long before we have a term called invasive species, we had the white pine blisterrock brought in from other parts of the world. And that's a problem that's going to keep increasing, I'm sure you're aware of. More globalization, more invasive species. They were good for products, like I say. They were good for soil erosion and the other of those species, wildlife habitat. But eventually they might have begun to cut them for one thing or another. In the ecological succession that we have in the Northeast, the hardwoods are the natural forest in many, many of our acres. Not all, but many of them. And as the white pine began to thin out with age, the hardwoods came in and started to take over. Notice again, the rock is still in that corner. This is importantly from the same viewing spot. Until eventually we saw young forests like this. We'll see them out in our own fields now. One of the species that comes in like this, how many of you are familiar with these kind of patches in an old field of ash? ash can come in like that. In other parts of our northeast, aspen, trembling or quaking aspen, it's the same tree, but it's got different names, will come in. So there's a natural succession because the hardwoods are the common forest of our area. Until today, we have forests like this. This is not the Harvard diorama, this is an actual picture taken by a Harvard forester named Dave Foster. Now many of our city brethren will say, look at the wilderness. Isn't the wilderness wonderful? Well, what's so evidently obvious in this picture? This is that ain't wilderness. A stone fence. There may be a foundation, an old chimney, barbed wire running through a tree. But there's so many people who don't know the land, like I think most of us living out in this part of the country do. That's wilderness. It's not what I described to begin with. But it makes them happy to think that, and I guess I'm not going to disillusion them. What to remember? Money doesn't grow on trees, but wood does. And I quickly reiterate, I did not talk about the other benefits of forests. The water control. Literally, the forest has an impact on when the water runs off the land, how much of it runs off the land, how much of it even hits the land. Because a lot of it is intercepted, snowfall is setting way, soil erosion, wildlife habitat, aesthetics. There's so many other benefits. They've tried to put dollar values on them, but there are a lot of the things we don't pay for. We don't pay for the air we breathe. So what the heck, let's pollute. We often don't pay for the aesthetic view. Somebody's paying for it. Somebody's paying taxes on the land. Many people say landowners, and probably that means a lot of farmers, should be paying for those things. Trees and forests are renewable resources. If we manage the land right, we can have them indefinitely. Now, I just said that, and that little back of the mind popped up because it's going to change. And I don't know if indefinitely is a good word anymore, because we have one major problem that we haven't figured out yet. Anyone know what I'm referring to? Global climate change. I was at a conference back in the early part of the year where the Duke geochemical, he had a title about 8 feet long, predicted that by the end of this century, our beautiful sugar maple beech and yellow birch, that most of us are familiar with and love, will be gone. It'll exist in Canada, but no longer here. And we'll have oak hickory forest, which is common in the dry, warm areas. So how that's going to play out, we don't know. But if we manage well, we can have our cake and eat it. And trees do grow money. Thank you. Anybody have any questions or comments?
Somebody take some questions?
Yeah. Is there such a thing in our country anymore as virgin forests?
Yeah, virgin forest, most of the wilderness is as close to virgin forest as you're going to get. There are places that then even go further and would say, out of this wilderness, this is truly virgin. When you go up in the Adirondacks, for example, to make a distinction, you got to be sure what you're looking at, state land or private land, because it's about 2.8 state and 3.2 private. But let's just consider the state land. It's called wilderness. It should be very close to what the colonialists found when they got here. But there was a lot of cutting that took place in the Adirondacks, and still is. So you still might be in an area that's been cut. But it was cut lightly, maybe had a few roads that have disappeared since then. So there's a little difference, but they're close.
How do you tell?
Well,
How does one know?
You look for these signs, even the big ones like I showed in that one picture, the walls, the barbed wires and things like that. You look for the old road beds. You can do it with more scientific research into the root systems and things like that to see when these trees grew. And do you find any stumps? Sometimes we see stumps out there that look blackened. And maybe from a fire, was it a human caused fire, was it a natural fire, that's another investigation. Sometimes it's not even fire, it's a thing called coal fungus, which will just come right up over a stump and it looks like it's been burned, but it's just a fungus. So there are a lot of ways, but there takes a little bit of investigation.
Let me insert something about this succession business. My wife and I bought 30 acres, well, actually at that time, 64 acres of an old farm that Jim White had farmed. Maybe you know Jim, remember Jim. Sonny had worked on that farm, and he told me where he was getting hay and so forth. 1971, we bought the property, we sold some of it, we now have 30 acres left, and you can see when you drive by where I cut the grass. The rest of it looks like wilderness. But then recently, Sonny brought me a picture. He thinks it was dated for 1939 or thereabouts. Big picture like this of our property. It is almost all cropland. There's a little bit of forest, a little bit of woods on it. It's almost all cropland. Now, if you try to walk through that area, there are places you can't go. The vegetation is so thick, you can't get through there. I tried to keep a pathway open so we could take guests up and around and walk around there. Couldn't keep up with it. It's just really thickly vegetated.
That's what I mentioned, that we are very lucky in the Northeast that we have such a resilient forest. I used to work on the eastern Adirondacks, and the white pine is a major species there. And I used to marvel at it, and then I had the same experience down in North Carolina with yellow poplar. I would say you can't do more than scuff your foot in the dirt, come back in a year, you're going to have a white pine, or down there you're going to have a yellow poplar. Parts of the world, the tropics I mentioned, after a few years, it won't come back. Parts of our own country have very difficult times getting the forest back. But we're also lucky because our forest here in the Northeast is called the asbestos forest. I used to teach fire control, and I took a fusee. Everybody knows what a fusee is. And I wanted the students to experience a little forest fire. They were all ready to put it out, and I'd stand there with a fusee, and it would burn a hole through the duff. And that's all it would do. It would not spread. We have so much moisture that it's very difficult to get a forest fire going here. Don't take that to mean we haven't had them, couldn't have them. It's just very difficult. When you read about the big fires out west or in Florida, totally different environmental conditions. Our forest is very difficult to get through.
Was out there, they reforested the plain seedlings, or they clear cut?
I mentioned that 660,000 acres, 300,000 acres of it was planted with red pine. Much of the rest was left to come in naturally. Planting is still a big thing. You don't always have to plant after clear cutting, if you do it right again. It's just like the doctor. If he does heart surgery right, you're fine. If he doesn't, you're in trouble. But if you do it right and have the proper trees adjacent to it, the wind proper, the seeds will come in and you're going to move forward from it. The problem is at times when they do clear cutting, I'm not making out like they're saints because we've made mistakes too. If you do clear cutting on the wrong slopes, too steep, too much rain, then the erosion hits and it's too late. Thank you, folks.
Anything else, folks? We got some refreshments over here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I was so glad you came.